Hi, my name is Alys Brooks, and I'm presenting on documentation. Quick thank you to the organizers for having me, and you all for showing up for my talk. Quickly, I'm Alys Brooks. I'm a software developer at Taiwan, where I've done multiple projects. A lot of mine are now under the Lambda Island umbrella, which is all our cool open source libraries, which you should check out. A couple years before I was a software developer, I was a technical writer, which I mention because that is what I'm going to talk about today, technical writing. So let's get into it. So before we kind of go into the actual nuts and bolts of assessment, I think a helpful thing to know is like, what does a complete set of documentation look like? So a useful model is the 4-document model. So this breaks it into these 4 kinds of documents. Tutorials, which are learning focused, how-tos, which are kind of task focused, understanding or explainer documents, which cover concepts, and reference, which are focused on detailed explanations, and kind of describe specific components of the system or specific details. To help that sink in a little bit more, I'm going to go over examples of each of these. So the first is tutorials. A non-technical example are the TV show Bob Ross, which was popular in the US on public television a couple decades ago, and then gained new life on Twitch as it was streamed. But the concept is that each week he goes through a painting and explains exactly what you should do. The idea being, even if you've never painted before, you can grab a paintbrush and paint along with him. So this is kind of the perfect example of a tutorial. It's explaining what to do, it's concrete, and it's for beginners and for people who are trying to learn. So a great non-technical example is Closure for the Brave and True, which is beginner focused and helps you get up and running on Closure. It's not a pure tutorial, unlike Bob Ross. It also has some explanation in, being a book rather than a TV episode. But a lot of it is learner focused, just like a tutorial. So I think it's a great example. And I think it's a great resource to recommend to people you know who want to learn Closure. So Divio, which is a company that kind of promotes this model and uses it themselves, has kind of made their diagram, and this is my version of it. So they kind of put tutorials in the upper left corner, so it's study-oriented and practical, not very theoretical, and not kind of work or task-oriented. That might strike you as confusing because often tutorials are very concrete, but usually the things you make in a tutorial are not, often they're not, they're for the sake of learning rather than for the sake of accomplishing the thing you're trying to build. There are exceptions. Next category is how-tos. A great example of a how-to is a recipe. This one is for cake. So it explains all the steps and all you need for it. It's not necessarily written for a particular group. Basically anyone who's interested in doing this might check it out. Someone who's never baked a cake before, or someone who's baked many cakes before and just needs to remember how much vanilla to put in might also consult this recipe. So a technical example would be an article like this, which explains how to launch a REPL. So Divio puts how-tos in the upper right corner, so it's practical like tutorials, but it's much more oriented in a specific task. Setting up a cake is something you may do many times, and you may consult the recipe every time. And that's not because you're learning, it's because you need to make a cake. The next category are understanding documents. So this is a non-technical example from the book The Visual Display of Quantitative Information by Edward Tufte, and which is just describing how to use diagrams, charts, graphs to display numbers, basically. So this is a page from the book, and it's features several bad examples, and it kind of explains the issues present in these graphs. But it's going over the concepts. It's not really teaching you how to make a graph, just giving you the context to understand them better and hopefully make better decisions relating to visualizing data yourself. But it's not walking you through step by step. A great example in tech are basically talks like, in some ways like the one I'm giving. But an example you might know is Richicky's The Value of Values. So you can see a slide that he's presenting. It's explaining a specific concept, which he's going to contrast with Clojure's style of programming. So it's not really a, don't do this, it's a, this is what we're kind of moving away from in Clojure, and understanding that philosophy will hopefully help you use Clojure more effectively. But it's not as direct. He's not telling you a series of steps. And it's, this one in particular, I think, is aimed at people who have used Clojure before, or at least seen one of his talks. So Divio puts explanations or understanding documents into the bottom left corner. So they're kind of oriented towards study. They're oriented towards people who are trying to level up their skills or gain more understanding, or may actually be students. But they're more theoretical, unlike tutorials. The last category is reference. So this is a great example of a non-technical reference, a dictionary. So you might go this when you need a book, you need a word, and you want to make sure you're using it correctly. Or if you're doing some research on the etymology of a specific word. However, it does not teach you how to use English, just the details of a very particular word. You probably would not read one of these cover to cover. Although some people have read famous dictionaries like this one cover to cover. as a challenge, but really it's meant to be to dip into as you need it. A great example from Clojure of reference documentation are doc strings. So these are available right in your REPL. This is the one for filter. So you might pull this up when you're trying to use filter, and you want to make sure you are putting the arguments in the right order. Or perhaps you have a question about how it works. So this would tell you that it returns a lazy sequence. It doesn't just spit out a vector, it uses the sequence abstraction. If you've never used the single argument version, it tells you it returns a transducer, although it doesn't explain what that is. So reference documents are often a little bit more advanced, although they don't have to be. Growing up, you may have used student dictionaries or learners' dictionaries. So reference documents can be oriented towards beginners. In the technical situation, they're often geared more towards people with some experience. So to go back to Divio's quadrants, reference is, of course, the fourth quadrant. So like HOWTOs, they're work-oriented. They're something you'd pick up as you're working on something. But like explanations, they're theoretical rather than practical. So the four-document model is a great one, but it's still a model, and like all models, it's incomplete. So I'm going to go over some special cases. I think these kind of help illustrate the model even more, and they might kind of pique your mind, kind of help you think of things you might be missing in your documents. I think most of these are really useful ones to include, so I want to give them special mention for that reason as well. So these are inspired by two useful articles in documentation. One is by Steve Losh, and the other is by Hillel Wayne. And I've linked them in the kind of handout or accompanying guide to this talk. So the first one is the hairball, which is like a how-to, but it's kind of meant to follow soon after the tutorial. It explains a particularly complex, realistic example. So you've kind of removed the simplifications you might have put in to the tutorial. So if you kind of left out some details in order to get someone off the ground in the tutorial, here's where you would put those details back in. Another category of document is the conceptual overview. So these are very similar to those understanding or explanation documents I covered earlier, but they cover a pretty broad, they're much broader and may cover basically everything and show how they fit together. They're also more aimed at beginners. Another category are case studies. So these are examples of solving an interesting or kind of illustrative real-world problem. So these are similar to HOWTO, but probably don't include as many details and are probably more high level. These can also kind of serve a marketing role. as a way of saying, yes, we can do this. But I'm going to focus on the documentation slide here. Another category are troubleshooting. So these are common or sometimes not so common examples. Usually they're organized by the symptom or the error message or the exception name. So you can find what's wrong. So of course these should give you a sense of how to fix the problem. In some cases it might be an opportunity to explain something if the error is probably the result of a miscommunication or a misunderstanding. One example of that is in Clojure. You might get errors about Clojure trying to cast one thing to another thing. In some cases, that might mean the user is a beginner and they've kind of mixed up some concepts in their mind, so they're trying to pass a vector when they should be passing a map, or vice versa. So in some cases, you can use the troubleshooting to kind of explain and correct the misunderstanding. But usually the focus is on solving the problem. The last one is perhaps the most diffuse. So that's this concept of REPL sessions, which is one we at Gaiwan use on some of our projects, including Lambda Island. It's basically a source file with examples you can execute to kind of get up and running, so you have like an actual, so things are kind of set up for you to play around with. So these are somewhat similar to notebooks, kind of related to literate programming, which is kind of the concept of weaving your code in with text or diagrams or graphics or images. Some of these might be taken directly from like research or exploration that you're doing to develop the project. So they could be very in the weeds. But you could kind of adapt them to cover a lot of different kinds of documentation. You could probably use a notebook form to make tutorials, or as a reference, or as an understanding, or as a how-to. So they're a very malleable special case. Yes. So now that you have a kind of lay of the land, it's time to actually do the assessment. So first you want to do an inventory, so you kind of want to gather up all the documents that you have published. But you might also want to gather up things that aren't really published, but could form the basis for new documents. Maybe that's a helpful email that's been kind of passed around, or some answers to questions on your Discord or Slack, or some notes sitting on someone's hard drive. So this might go really quickly if you just have a README, or it might take a while if there's a lot of these random documents that cover this or that part of your system. The next step is to categorize them. So kind of fitting it into the 4-document model, but also kind of making sure you understand what areas they cover. Something like installation might be a complete document covering all the ways to install the project. Or it might be kind of incomplete and really only cover a small part of the picture. So it can be helpful to kind of glance over at these documents, especially the headings and sections, and kind of see what they cover. This might also be a time to write down or make note of who wrote it, because maybe they are kind of responsible for it and they should review any changes to it, or maybe you aren't the one to make the changes and they should make the changes. So if you have like a pretty clear division of responsibility on your team, writing down kind of the owner might be a good idea too. Finally, you want to kind of step back and identify things that are missing or not documented, and maybe things that are kind of spread out and need to be joined together. Or maybe things that are mixed together but really should be separate. This isn't the only way to evaluate your documentation. And here are a couple more strategies, including just reading through all of it. Another doing a complete read-through is great when the project is small enough, but may not be feasible for larger projects. Another approach is kind of having people new to the tool kind of test it out. This gives you feedback on your documentation and your project. This is great when people are already doing this because they are new to your project and need to learn how to use it. It does require some time commitment on their part and on your part to organize their feedback. So it's a fairly high effort, but high reward. The other thing is to kind of take over the backlog, or to look over the backlog and go through issues that are tag documentation or mention documentation. This is a really good idea because it ensures your issue tracker is in a good shape as you add more issues. And also might give you a chance to close stale issues, which means your issue tracker will be useful when considering what documentation projects to take on later. Finally, a useful technique is to simply consult and ask around. Ask other developers, people who do QA or product management or UX design or technical support. Either things they don't understand or they find missing in the documentation, or things they see other people missing. This is especially nice if you have a large team with a lot of different people. If it's just you and another person and you both kind of do the same thing, still good to check in with them, but you might not learn as much. This might make you wonder when to bring in an expert. And there's a couple questions. One is the audience. If your readers have a very different background, technical writers are great at bridging that gap. but if your audience is similar to you, you may kind of already have the context to write for them effectively, because you know what it's easy for you to determine what you need to tell them. The next question is scope. Is your documentation mostly complete and you just have a few holes here and there to fill? Or is it missing an entire manual that should be written? And of course the last one is, do you have the money? Can you hire or bring on someone? This is, it's good to keep in mind that having good documentation can also save you money, because it allows you to bring on new people more quickly, and it might make your product, if your project is a product that people buy, it makes it more appealing, and may increase your revenue. So there's not only monetary costs, there may also be monetary benefits. So don't forget that. What's next, and what if you don't have time? Well, I'm running out of time in this talk, so hopefully this ends with the right level of urgency, matching the topic. So I will say, having to juggle a lot of different concerns is kind of the norm for developers. Kind of see this with things like usability or performance or accessibility, that you kind of have to keep them on the back of, at least in the back of your mind at all times. Also, keep in mind that you are probably already doing some technical communication, at least informally. You're talking with your colleagues, you're writing up issues, you're writing commit messages, and so on. So even if you haven't written documentation formally before, you've probably done technical communication before, maybe a lot of it. Since I am running low on time, I will kind of jump ahead, and these are some useful techniques labeled with whether they take seconds or hours. The idea being you can kind of fit them in as you have spare time. But this list will also be provided in a webpage form for you to reference later. So thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time.